Now I'm going to put on a different hat to be the moderator of our next session, which is called From Scholarship to Public Interpretation. And we have 3 panelists with us, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes about their experiences, talking about really how slavery has been and is being interpreted now at their various sites. And then we will have a discussion. I have lots of questions, and I know you do too. So we look forward to what is to follow. And our first speaker is Christy Coleman, who is president of the American Civil War Center at Historic Tredegar in Richmond, Virginia.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Interpreting slavery at historic sites. Well, this is something that I have been personally involved with for a very long time now, more years than I care to think about. But I will say, what is interesting is that 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, while I was working at Colonial Williamsburg, our staff decided to do something a little different with our interpretation of slavery. You see, we had been, the whole African American Interpretations and Presentations Unit, as it used to be called, had functioned at Williamsburg for 15 years by 1994. And it started, the interpretations started with living history. There was not much in terms of material culture, at least on the surface, that the institution had to really talk about slavery. And I say that because the truth of the matter is, as we got smarter about what we were doing, every single thing, every single building, every single street in Williamsburg allowed us to talk about slavery. We just didn't know how to do that yet. So the introduction of living history. And so let me say this about living history. I think it is still one of the most compelling methodologies at our disposal, if we use it properly. And more often than not, it's most of what I see out there still is really bad. Really, really bad. And why is it bad? Because the institution hasn't yet determined what is strategically important for that character to convey. We just say, oh, wouldn't it be nice if we interpreted Jenny the cook? And then she can talk about cooking. And then she can talk about her family, and wouldn't that be great? That's not interpretation. You wouldn't plan an exhibit off of something so slim. And yet we do that with a lot of our programming. Even when it comes to our in some cases, even the exhibits when we're talking about African Americans, we think if we give them a name, we give them a place, we give them a function, our job is done. It is not. And I go back to the importance of strategic importance. Why that character? What message do they convey? So in October of 1994, Williamsburg decided, AAIP decided, that we wanted to take things a little bit further with a program that we had been doing for a number of years. It was a foundation-wide special event called Public Times. And Public Times programming, the purpose of it was to help our visitors understand how Williamsburg would swell during the times when the House of Burgesses would meet. People would come to Williamsburg from all over the colony. They would exchange business. They would settle their end-of-year debts. They would buy and sell property. They would do all of these things. And from the AAIP perspective, we had already been talking about and doing programs about seeing friends and family when this period of time came around, because people often brought their slaves with them. We had already been dealing with the impending slave auction, but we never showed it. And so in '94 we decided, me being a new director, full of spunk, said, why the hell not? It's time. We've been interpreting for 15 years. We've got the chops. We know how to do this. But we also recognize that how we did it would be really important, because public perception is one of the issues you have to address when you are trying to interpret anything. What does the public expect of me? Well, when it comes to slave auction, most people's vision in their minds is Kunta Kinte on the dock with the chains on his arms and, up and down, and people with the whips trying to keep him in line, or inspecting teeth and, feeling people up, and that's the public perception. So our slave auction wasn't like that, because it was an estate auction. It was, man dies, he has debts, we're going to sell off a bunch of his stuff. And among these were 4 household slaves. Now, needless to say, the public perceptions started clashing with our scholarship. So even before the program began, there were some pretty loud folks who started to protest this event. And things are getting really, really deep when you get a phone call from a dear friend in New York City who says, hey, I just heard on the radio you're getting ready to sell black people on the streets to tourists, right? And of course he was saying that to me tongue-in-cheek because he knew better. I mean, he knew what I did, but that's how bad it got. And so the next thing you know, I'm getting phone calls from Phil Donahue and Oprah Winfrey and the Today Show saying, all right, what are you doing? This is a big deal. NAACP, ACLU, the Young Communists at William and Mary. Everybody's talking about us, doing this thing where we are degrading the history of people, and, Williamsburg was not the right place to have this kind of interpretation, because Williamsburg was basically just Disney-fied history, which I took extraordinary exception to, because it just expressed more than anything else what people were afraid of. And again, being as young as I was, for the first time, I really had to give pause about what this was going to be. And, fortunately enough, the leadership at the foundation at the time, the vice president for the historic area, his name was Steve Elliott, and the president of the foundation at the time was Robert C. Wilburn. And Steve, I'll never forget, Steve, a more cautious personality, Steve said, well, it's really kind of getting a little intense. And, what are you thinking? We were about 4 days out. So what are you thinking? And I looked at him and I said, well, I'm thinking we're doing a program. Just like we normally do. And he says, okay. He said, well, we're getting a few calls from some donors. And I said, I'm sure you are. I'm getting a few too. They're calling my house. At the time, I had an unlisted number, so I was getting calls from around the country. Some of them weren't very nice. And I said, what do you want me to do? And he said, I've never interfered with your programming before. He said, what's your gut tell you? I said, we should do this. He says, okay, let's go see Bob. We went to see Bob, and Bob says, I'm proud of you. So what do we need? What do we need to do? How do we need to tighten this up? And I said, I have no idea. But, from the interpreter's perspective, we've gone through it. We've gone through our timeline. We've gone through our action points, because we never scripted it. In our work, this was a team of people who were very accustomed to working with each other, a team of people who trusted each other explicitly, the character interpreters and the African-American interpreters. And so we never scripted our interactions with each other. But we did outline what needed to happen so that we had the actor's improvisational, real moment with what we would produce. And it was a good thing that they didn't tell me until after the fact. But what Bob did is he engaged the security department and the local police department. So here we were on the day of the event with protesters coming down the street, but also throngs of supporters. You see, I grew up in Williamsburg, so my church people, they were there. And members of our local NAACP who were outraged that the state NAACP had done what they had done without, because I'd already talked to them about what we were intending to do, and it was going to be a little different, but and they knew our work. They trusted us. So we had to, the facilities department had to put speakers. This was the first time we ever used wireless and hidden microphones. They had to put speakers in the trees because, there were 2,000 to 3,000 people out on the street for this one program. We had never had anything quite that big. Our big programs up to that point had been maybe 400 people. So now I'm looking out at a group of 2,000 to 3,000 people. And we were, as a team, very, very nervous about that day. And we did pray together behind the building, that we stayed true to the history, that we stayed emotionally honest with what we were doing, and then we did it. And it changed a lot. Even the protesters, one of the most vocal of whom said, I was wrong, on camera, caught him on camera. He said, I was wrong. Pain had a face. History had meaning in a way I couldn't have imagined. I'm going to have to go back and really think about what I saw. This is the same man who said, before we began and came into the building where we were prepping, I'm going to shut this down. I'm going to shut you down. I'm going to do this. And Bob Wilburn said, and the man said, I'm willing to go to jail. And Bob Wilburn said, I'm ready to have you arrested. I love that man. And the point is, the organization, in the heat of this, even with donors calling Bob and saying, you do this, we're going to cut off funding. People actually said that to him. And Bob said, well, we're going to miss you. I mean, that's remarkable, remarkable commitment. And it's extraordinarily important. And I know that a lot of sites, people really don't always feel that administration has their back when things get tough. That's why it has to be an institutional decision about why these programs are strategically important. Fast forward to now, historic Tredegar. The American Civil War Center was the first museum to interpret the American Civil War's causes, course, and legacies from Union, Confederate, and African American perspectives under one roof in one exhibit. And I will tell you, the interpretation of slavery in the exhibit and the role of slavery in the Civil War has been one that has been greatly debated, continues to be debated for reasons that are beyond me, because the scholarship is very clear. But we're in Richmond. We're in the heart, in the capital city of the Confederacy. So states' rights and honorable causes and all of that kind of stuff prevail, as do the notion of black Confederates. You think I'm kidding? So the interpretation of slavery at our site and its role in this major national trauma is significant. And we every day are contending with the three elephants in the room. You're dealing with your history. What does the scholarship actually tell you? We're dealing with heritage. This is what my daddy told me, what my granddaddy told him. This is what I have in my family. These are the notes that my people kept. And then we have memory, which out of the 100+ people in this room, you all are not going to have the same recollection of the things that I'm telling you. And we contend with these every single day. You contend with these at your site every single day. Because there will be people who come to you who are expecting to see, if you're choosing to interpret slavery, they want to see their heritage perspective. They want to see where, women are being raped and children are being ripped from their arms and people are being, just brutally dealt with on a day-to-day basis. That's what they want to see because that's their expectation, because that's what heritage tells them. Then you have other peoples whose heritage is telling them, but we loved each other and we took care of each other and, it was really an economic system, but because slaves were so valuable, we couldn't do those kinds of things to them because, it just didn't make economic sense. And then you have to deal with the scholarship that says, the reality is in the middle somewhere. The reality is it is still a system of non-freedom. It is still a system where personal choice, regardless of the clothes on your back and the food in your belly, this is a system that at its core strips away basic human rights. That's what it is. Your visitors should never question that point. If they do, you haven't done your job. It's that plain. As far as the memory, well, here's the good part. Nobody has a real memory of anything. Their memories are the movies that they see. And guess what? There's a new one on the horizon. Don't you just love Django Unchained? And this represents another need, though, and that is the need to have this hero type who fights back. Because the real life heroes, all of them were executed for wanting their freedom. Most of them were executed. And so now there's another visual. Now there's another thing. And I find it so fascinating that in an effort to prove one's manhood in such an inhumane system, that murder is the choice. Isn't that fascinating to you? Anyway, my 15 minutes are about up. But again, my primary point is this. When we are in the practicalities of interpreting slavery, whichever methodologies you choose, it becomes important to put back what the institution itself took away, and that is the humanity of the individuals with whom you are working. The scholarship has to be tight, and the strategic purpose has to be clear. If you are successful on that point, the challenges that you face in terms of visitor perspective ease away because you have those important backbones to give your program strength and the credibility. Because the fact is they come to our places because they trust us, even when what they see challenges us. And on that note, I'll wait for your questions.
John Franklin will be next. He represents the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture.
Thank you. A number of years ago, a photographer friend of mine, Titus Higgins, had photographed at plantations in North and South Carolina both African American men and women and European American men and women in period costumes in situations that he set up. And I'd seen all of the photographs, and they were called, as a group, Plantation Lullaby, and he asked me to write something for his catalog. And it came out as this poem, Our Ancestors. Where we live, where our ancestors lived, we live. Where our ancestors walked, we walk. Where they traveled the Middle Passage, we cruise. Where they offloaded from Baltimore clippers, we dine. Where they marched in shackles, we legislate. Where our ancestors were sold, we work. Where they toiled in the fields, we garden. Where they worked in their owner's house, we tour. Where they fished, we fish. Where our ancestors raised their children, we raise ours. Where they were punished, we are punished. Where they mourned, we mourn. Where they worshiped, we worship. Where they rejoiced, we rejoice. Where they resisted, we too resist. Where they sought justice, we seek justice. Where our ancestors escaped, we drive. Where our ancestors walked, we walk. Where our ancestors lived, we lived.
Wow.
Now, I grew up in the household of the historian John Hope Franklin and the librarian Aurelia Whittington Franklin. Could you be in a place to have access to more information? Well, before I was born, my mother actually funded my father's research for From Slavery to Freedom, which he wrote in 1 year, in 1946. It came out in the fall of 1947 as he moved to Howard University. And he said in doing the research for that book, which he thought was the first comprehensive book on African American history and culture, he lost his innocence because he really learned what slavery and the slave trade was about. Now, 50 years ago, at the 100th anniversary of the Civil War, African Americans were little discussed. You can look at the programs, the conferences of the time. But since then, think how much scholarship has been done, particularly by African American women, looking into the lives of women and children enslaved that no one had really taken under consideration. Now, we owe a lot of what we now call public history to an organization that's almost 100 years old, the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Their annual luncheon is today, and I'm missing it, though we bought a table for 10 students, so students could attend in Washington today. I was doing a program several years ago, and I called my father, who was still living at the time, and I said, "When did you meet Carter G. Woodson?" He said, "Oh, October 1937, Petersburg." And Carter G. Woodson created this organization of historians and lay historians. You don't usually hear that term, but of people for whom this is their passion, their avocation, not just their field of study. And that organization believed in making sure that African Americans knew the history, know the history, and share the history with their generations of children. Other organizations have caught up to the whole concept of public history, but I think that's really part of its foundation in the United States, certainly looking at African American history and culture. When I was a little boy in New York, my father was asked to be the visiting lecturer at churches of all denominations. And I would traipse behind him, and they went from very quiet churches to very lively churches. Some of those scared me to death because I heard all about fire and brimstone. And when we went to Hawaii, my father was teaching for the summer in Hawaii, we went to the volcano. I said, "Oh, here it is. This is hell. Here it is." As I looked down into that volcano. But the Public Library of New York would always have a little stand in the lobby of the church. If you're interested in this, you can read more about it. And my father would talk about different time periods, different aspects of African American and American history. And there would be the public library right there in partnership in a way. If you want to read more about this, this is how you can go do it. Well, we're creating this National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington. We began construction February of last year. And the museum was conceived differently from our other Smithsonian sister institutions. We have a board. Their responsibility is governance and raising the $500 million, half from Congress and half from the private sector. We've done pretty well during a difficult economy. But my father chaired the Scholarly Advisory Committee because we believed that this museum could not exist separated from the scholarly community. And so we have physical anthropologists, we have legal specialists, we have people in all forms of culture on that board. And they guide us through this process. This began in 2006. Our meeting in December was on how is spirituality and religion woven through all the different exhibitions at the museum. Our meeting in March will look at race and how race is reflected in different parts of the museum. And these scholars keep us in check and say, well, have you read so-and-so? You're looking at this aspect, well, you must get the latest scholarship by so-and-so, 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 so-and-so. So this is a direct link between the museum as we're shaping these 12 exhibitions and the scholarly community. And then each of our exhibitions has its own academic advisory committee. So the musical Crossroads, the exhibition called The Power of Place, looking at different experiences in different decades and different regions of the United States, has an advisory group. The military, the sports history, the fine arts, all have academic advisory committees to engage the team of educators and designers and curators and audience specialists to make sure that not only do we have rich content, but are we communicating it in a clear way to our different audiences. Now, my own specialty is the French-speaking Africa and the Caribbean. And I've passed out maps to you, and this is our map time. Does everyone have the large map? Please turn to the side that says the African Diaspora Map 1. Now, when we present U.S. history, unfortunately, we're so focused on the British colonial and the escape from the British colonial that we don't look at Florida before it becomes part of the United States. We don't look at Louisiana before it becomes part of the United States. We don't look at Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands before they become part of the United States, because they're not U.S. until Virgin Islands 1917. You know. This map shows us, and part of our mission is to situate the African American experience in an international context. Both within the continent, you see the migrations from the interior, all those brown arrows, to the coast, across the Sahara, into East Africa, into West Africa. And if you look at the right-hand side of the map, much of this controlled by the Sultan of Oman and Zanzibar. The people are taken over the last 2,000 years into the Gulf, into the Red Sea, into Iraq. They're Afro-Iraqis from 900 AD. We don't hear about these people. The influences of Africa on Goa, on southern India. We don't learn about that. That's not part of our consciousness or awareness. When you look at the arrows going north, we don't think of the African presence in Europe. Did any of you happen to see the exhibition that just closed at the Walters, the African presence in Renaissance Europe? Well, you look at those paintings and they're black people in the streets. But we're not taught about that, so it's not part of our awareness and consciousness. Now, when my father came to Monticello for the first time, he asked, where are the slave cabins? This is in the early 1960s. They said, we don't know. My father said, that's not possible. And look at how far we've come to last year. Our museum and Monticello developed the exhibition that is now in Atlanta, but opened in our gallery in the American History Museum, Slavery at Jefferson's Monticello, and explored in partnership with Monticello not only the 600 names of people who were enslaved during Jefferson's lifetime, but looked at the families as real people, real individuals who they were. And the third part of the exhibition looks at their descendants and the interviewing that's being done now with the descendants of the families from this piece of land. When I was in Paris last year, you remember that Jefferson was our representative from 1785 to 1789. In Paris, he's after Benjamin Franklin as the first representative to Paris. Well, I always assumed that Sally Hemings and her brother were kind of alone in Paris. But the African community was so significant in 1770 that the French commissioned a special census on black people. Where are you from? Are you free? Are you enslaved? Did you come here from Africa? Did you come here from the Caribbean? Did you come here from Louisiana? And there are over 25,000 blacks living in France in 1770. They don't do census like that now because it's against the secular state. So we don't know these percentages in the French census today. But for 1770, we know. If you look at the left-hand side of the map, you see the arrows taking people to all of these different parts of the Americas. And we in the United States think that we have a large African American community. Please turn the map over. Now here that is David Eltis actually in the room? Hello, my hero. You should all get this book, The Atlas of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. This is a summary map of the 189 maps that David Eltis and David Richardson, you could only be David being part of this project. David Richardson, David Eltis, David Bryan Davis, and David Blight. You weren't David, you couldn't be part of the project. But look at this, because first we think of West Africa from Nigeria to Senegal. And we think that most people in the United States are from those areas. This is just what we commonly think. But look at West Central Africa there. Approaching 6 million coming from Congo, Angola. And then look at the left-hand side. And start at the top. And look how relatively small the numbers are going to North America. To New England, that Providence trade, the Brown family. Chesapeake, our region, coming right into Baltimore. The Charleston group coming into the Carolinas and Georgia, and the area that I study the most, coming into the Gulf, into what we now know as Louisiana and Mississippi. But look at the numbers going to Cuba, 800,000, to Jamaica, 1 million, to Cuba. And then if you add these numbers up for Brazil, we're approaching 6 million. So the U.S. story is part of a so much larger story that we miss the opportunity to link the U.S. story to the Caribbean, to Central and South America, to all the European countries involved in the trade. And the trade, remember, is European goods being brought out of Europe, Bavarian porcelains, textiles, iron, weapons, wine, liquor, all of this being sold down the West African coast. And then you have the floating prisons going across the Atlantic. And then the return of the triangle is the ships taking the cotton and the sugar and the molasses and the timber and the cocoa and coffee to Europe. So they're only human cargo in one of these pieces of the triangle. The second map, which is on two sides, reminds us that in each part of the Americas there is a different date of abolition. Yes, I do. So that the earliest date of abolition, this is from a French book called The Atlas of Slavery. You have Saint-Domingue or Haiti, the very first, 1793. But if you look at both sides, you see that every country in South America has different dates. Canada and the British colonies are all 1833. The French actually abolished slavery twice with the French Revolution, and then Napoleon reinstates slavery, and then the second abolition is 1848. But this is how the history of slavery is hemisphere-wide, and we must remember to place it in that context so that there are people who say, well, you know, I'm from Jamaica, I didn't come through the slave trade. They say, were you just a guest of the Queen? So there are people who haven't learned this history where they came from. Our Peruvian, our Bolivian, our Argentinian colleagues may not have learned the history of the slave trade and abolition in their history books. And this is the battle. The national museums, if they don't tell the African part of the story, they're not telling the whole story. They may tell the indigenous part and the European part, but they have to include the African part. So there's this marvelous exhibition that's traveling on the African presence in Mexico. And for most people, Mexican or not, it is new information. And so we work with museums in the Caribbean who are trying to represent their culture as more complex than it may have been presented by colonial museums. And increasingly, we're meeting our colleagues from Nicaragua and Brazil and Canada who are trying to assure that the history is complete in their institutions. And I'll stop there.
I think you could. John, I think you could go on, and we would be.
Yes, I could.
What I mean to say is, we want you to go on and on, to go on. But next is Angela Roberts, who comes from us. She is a National Park Service employee, and she is the Special Events Coordinator at the Hampton National Historic Site in Towson, Maryland. Welcome, Angela.
Hello. Hello, everyone. Actually, my formal title is Park Ranger, but just with all institutions, the federal government has downsized, so I do a lot of things. And my primary job is to give tours, even though lately I have not been doing that on a daily basis. But I'm still in the trenches, and I do it regularly enough. And what my goal here is today is to give you an idea of how to interpret slavery. As my colleague to the right of me stated, that there are many ways you can interpret slavery, and one way isn't necessarily better than the other, but I'm going to give you what has been effective for me and what I have received a lot of positive feedback from. John was saying earlier there are two types of historians, lay historians and formally trained historians. I have the passion of a lay historian, but I am formally trained. And I tell everyone that my mission in life is to tell the trials, tribulations, and the triumphs of my ancestors. This is what I do. I eat, live, and breathe it. And before I start tours, I will tell people that I'm going to say things to you that you probably have not heard, because history has been suppressed, things have been lied about, and it's his story, and I'm here to tell you the story. If you have any way, if you feel like you need to debate with me, just go check out your information, come back, and we can have an intelligent debate. But until then, just listen up. Yesterday, someone spoke about how to get African Americans to historic sites. And since most of us are museum professionals, we do see the demographic being 40-plus white Americans. That's the way it is. Now, Hampton National Historic Site, that's where I work, is just right outside of Baltimore, which is a predominantly black city. And it's right down the street from the mall. I tell people that all the time. Yet, most of the people who come are white Americans. And that is largely due to the fact it's been a part of the National Park Service since 1948. And it's one of the largest slave plantations in the state of Maryland, and it's the most northern southern plantation that the federal government owns. And you will be hard-pressed to see a better plantation than Hampton. And I'm not just saying that because I've worked there. I've gone to several, and it's even better than the Monticello. Only thing the Monticello has over Hampton is the view. That is the only thing. That is the only thing. The Ridgeleys were the people who owned the estate for 165 years, and 95% of what you see when you come to Hampton is original. We have original slave quarters, not just what used to be there. Original slave quarters, the original overseer's home. The mansion, which was built and finished in 1790, was the family's summer home. And the Monticello and Mount Vernon can both fit in it and still have about 4,000 square feet left over. And this is what I tell people when they come, because I dress in period clothing when I do tours, not all the time, but as my colleague stated, there's a time and a place for that. I do it as a teaching tool, but sometimes when I'm asked, and I just received a text or email yesterday, someone asking me to dress in period clothing, and I'm going to respectfully decline because she wants to bring Baltimore City youth, and I think it would be more advantageous for me to be there in my ranger uniform, because that's something they don't see, an African-American woman as a national park ranger speaking to them intelligently. I will do the period clothing when it's the time and the place, but I do decline people at times. So getting back to Hampton National Historic Site, when you come to the mansion, you will be in awe. I mean, it's just fabulous. It just is. And people come there and they fantasize about what it would have been like to live like that during the 1800s. And the whole premise of my tours, and I've been educating our staff, including paid staff as well as volunteers, that this is American history. I will be so glad when I do not have to put the African American history, that prefix African. When I tell people, when I describe my education, I'll tell people I have 2 degrees in the African diaspora in America, because I want people to realize that this is American history. And if you realize that we have more similarities than we have differences, people will embrace this history. And we in the Park Service, we talk about universal themes. You can reach people. We're all human beings. We have certain things that we all need and we're all familiar with: love, family. So you need, when you interpret, you need to touch on whatever your universal theme is. Also, it's great when you have tangible items. We actually have shackles, iron collars that they put on people, whips, what have you. It's nothing like you can read about something, you can even look at it, but actually feeling it is a whole nother experience. So when people come to the mansion, I let them know, unless you're that part of that upper 1% of the U.S. economy, you would not have been welcomed here. Unless you're an Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male, a part of upper 1 or 2%. If you're Irish, forget about it. An Irish man was just a step above a black man during 1800s. Jewish, definitely, forget about it. And that, you'll see the light bulb going off in people's heads. So I'm going to show you some slides, and this is something that I actually present to young people, to anybody, really, just to let people know that this is American history. By no means am I minimizing my ancestors' experience. What I want you to realize that everybody has a story to tell. And if we realize that we were in a similar boats, you wouldn't have this division that we see now. So where would you have been during the 17 and 1800s? You see here I have a woman, a white American woman. She's a worker. And then right next to her is another depiction of a prominent white American woman with an enslaved woman behind her as a servant. And this whole thing far as power, and I'm a big proponent on the power of words, and I'll talk about that a little later, but this power thing is really an illusion. And it's something, and I'm getting ready to get on my soapbox, but it's something that the powers that be, that's how they keep the divide between us. We still, to this day, have 1% to 2% of the U.S. population that controls the majority of the wealth. The biggest difference is now the middle class, we don't have, or lower class, do not have iron collars around our necks and someone whipping us, but still, the majority of the population, the majority of the population have similar experiences. Now, these are the two people who had the mansion built, Hampton Mansion. Captain Charles Ridgely and his wife, Rebecca Dorsey, and they represent the upper 1%, 2%. Upon his death, he owns 24,000 acres, the Northampton Iron Works, mills, orchards, and he starts that Northampton Iron Works in 1761. There he has European indentured servants and enslaved African Americans making cannon and cannonballs during the Revolutionary War. The family was always wealthy, but that just catapults him into another stratosphere as far as wealth. And this is where, when I bring in interpretation, if you have at your sites, where you, like in Monticello as well, here they had European indentured servants. Most Americans, white Americans included, do not realize the plight of the European indentured servant. 40 to 48% of them lived to see the end of their contracts. So if you let people know that, and this man right here, Charles Ridgely, he was an equal opportunity oppressor. He was buying and selling white people just like he was doing black people. And I don't have time to get into that right now, but I give statistics, and just not even statistics, just facts on how he sells white people. And when you see that, I'll give you one, for instance, because this is his successor, Governor Charles Ridgely. Their name's either John or Charles. It gets confusing. But the governor enslaves up to 350 people, and he does manumit some of his enslaved on his deathbed. But the captain, when I would tell people about when the governor dies, let me put him back again, he puts in his will, if you're 25 to 45 and a female, you can go free. If you're 28 to 45 and a male, you can go free. And I wouldn't get any reaction, and that would just upset me, because I know I feel more than the average person feels about this. So, well, you know, just me telling you that would break up families. And then we got this tidbit, not only does he do that, but you can take an infant with you, but you have to leave a 2-year-old baby behind. That's when I started to get reactions. However, still, some people are like, the reason why, once I got this tidbit, and I've been on the site for a few years before I found out about the captain. Captain Charles, he buys from an Englishman in 1765 his 2-year-old, his 4-year-old, and his 6-year-old to be indentured to the captain until they reach 21 years of age. Then I would see the empathy. And it's because most of the people I speak to, I mean, usually, even though it's getting better and changing, rather, I should say, then I could see, wow. And then I would hear questions, well, what did he do with a 2-year-old? And I said, well, why didn't you ask me that when I told you that the governor keeps a 2-year-old? I mean, why was there a difference between the black and the white thing? And what I'm saying is not wrong. It's human nature. So these are the type, if you can get these type of facts or these type of facts or history, that would help you to get your audience to empathize. And here I have a portrait of enslaved African Americans and European indentured servants working together, because that is what they did. And also, this is right here in Virginia. Because of the treatment, and the Ridgeleys, who own Hampton, this is from Virginia, but the Ridgeleys write in their memoirs in the late 1800s that they treated the enslaved African American and the European indentured servant the same way. There was no difference other than if the European indentured servant lived long enough, he or she would see the end of their contract and they could leave. But here in this Virginia runaway ad, you'll see a white European indentured servant escaping with an enslaved African American. So if you tell your public that this is American history, and you actually make these connections, you'll see the light bulb go off and people can empathize. And that is Hampton National Historic Site, and that's the mansion. And that's why I told you the Monticello and Mount Vernon can both fit in there.
What's the square footage of that?
24,000 square feet. And it's the family summer home. And at their furnace, which was just 2 miles up from the mansion, people were working there, male and females. People were enslaved there, people were indentured there. And here you see a $10 reward. And I had to paraphrase this, but because it was a long ad, and this is 1788. And you see this mulatto enslaved man, I should say, running away. And if you see this was not the first time he ran away. On our farm site where the overseer's house is, I put up a table there, and I have items that people may have taken with them if they decide to flee bondage, and I have runaway ads, actual runaway ads from the furnace in Hampton, the Hampton Mansion, because I really got tired of people coming there and saying what they would have done, what they would not have done if they lived during this time period. You don't know what you would have done. And it's easy to say that in this time period. Sure, there were people who fought back. Sure, there were people who revolted. But would you have been like this man? If you read this man had escaped many times before, and they had just whipped him severely. And he ran away with the iron collar on him, yet this man has run away again. So look deep within yourself. Do you think you would have been this man? And I will tell my visitors, I try to look at it, I try to put myself, and I'm going to be honest with you. Maybe Moses was coming through. Maybe I would have hopped on her train, but I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. And this is another woman, same time, 1788. She's escaping from the furnace, and they described her as being very black, and she escapes with a mulatto child. So she's very black, and she has a mulatto child. You can put two and two together. And these are just some of the interiors of the home. 95% of what you see is original when you come. And we do have two of the few existing slave quarters in the United States that are made out of stone. Now, when people come to the site, I mean, it's fabulous. In 1855, the third mistress had this built. It's more for aesthetics. I mean, the average white American did not live in a nice home like this in 1855. Because it has wood floors, it is made out of stone, nice, pretty French architecture. So even though I will show people whips, chains, what have you, some people still get fixated on these beautiful homes. And the next session, we'll talk about structures. So when you have something this nice, you really have to emphasize to the visitor, this is not typical. And the average white American did not live in a nice house like this. And I will repeat myself, and you have to do that. I mean, I tell people I'm not insulting you, but I'm saying things multiple times so you understand me. Also, on our tour yesterday, someone mentioned about words and what you say, and I'm going to get into that in a moment. Because people were using certain words, and we use it freely here, like enslaved as opposed to slave. You have to keep in mind that this terminology is new to the public. So you really, from the onset of your tour, you need to explain people what is the verbiage, what is the terminology you're using. You cannot assume people know. You just can't, and it may become old hack to you, but you have to realize this is new to your visitor. And these are just some of the interiors of the slave quarters. See the wood floors there, and even has an upstairs to it that you can stand up fully erect. And there's an average size cabin, so. Could I have the next? Okay. And as I stated earlier, I'm a huge proponent on the power of words. In order to eliminate or at least help alleviate the feelings of shame and guilt, and that's on both sides, white Americans as well as black Americans, it's my opinion that what you say and how you say it is actually just as important as the scholarship. So I'm a big proponent on not using the term slave. There is an argument that when you use the word slave, it's more forceful, more powerful, and when you say enslave, you're sugarcoating it. We all know that slavery was horrible. As my colleague said earlier, we need to humanize the enslaved African Americans, and that's my mission, my whole theme of my tour. When you leave, I want you to realize that these were human beings with family, feelings, intellect, culture. It is my opinion when you say slave, you're dehumanizing them and you're making them faceless. Enslaved speaks the condition that they were forced into, not who they were. A servant is paid, a servant can leave. You really should not interchange slave or enslaved and servant, because my docents where I work, a lot of them do that because it's more comfortable. And I'm going to tell you, when you do have African Americans come through, because they come to me afterwards, and you say servant instead of slave, or enslaved rather, they're like, well, this person, they get the sense that you don't feel comfortable even talking about this. And we are the biggest obstacles in this interpretation. You need to get out of your own way. Do not worry about what your visitor thinks. You don't know what they're thinking. You don't. And even at first, if they have an aversion to what you're thinking or what you're speaking about, most of the time, by the end of your talk, they'll say, wow, I had no idea. Or you really put that in perspective. You might have, and chances are you have out of the 10, you have that one person said, I don't want to hear about this. I had one person walk out and say, I don't want to hear about this. I don't care. I don't care. As long as I said the truth and I said it in a way that was professional and sympathetic and empathetic, I really don't care. Because the people who have problems with this, and I'm going to be very blunt, they're going to die soon. So, yes. Yeah. And this is what you have to realize, because the vast majority of the public wants to hear this. Hampton, up until 2006, that's been a part of Park Service since 1948. Just 2006, we opened the slave quarters and the overseer's house to the public. And you got a furniture tour before that, or you were here about the fabulous Ridgeleys. And I'm here to tell you, and my master's is in art history, but the average American does not want to hear about furniture. That's a small group of people, and God bless them, but it's a small group of people.
Bless their heart.
Yes. And you can use terms such as bondsman, and also I realize the term fugitive and runaway are historically accurate, but when I'm interpreting, I use the term freedom seeker, because that puts in the person's mind that this person was seeking something that they should have had. Fugitive suggested the person was doing something wrong. Yes, legally, but that they weren't doing anything wrong. There's nothing wrong with wanting your freedom. So I'm hearing a wrap-up music and a fat lady singing, so I'll go on.
Thank you, Angela, and thank you, everyone. Those were outstanding presentations and very different in their approaches. So where would we like to start? Okay, we can, sure. Now, A few ground rules. Don't speak, question askers, until you have the mic in your hand. Number one.
First of all, thank you all so much for being here. I have cried twice while you were speaking and just felt justified in a lot of the stuff that I have been trying to do at my own site. So thank you very much for coming. Angela, do you have a copy of that Words Have Power that we can have? Because I feel sometimes that I work with the South Carolina State Park Service, 47 state parks, 10 or so of them that interpret slavery. It's hard to get across the scholarship to all the interpreters that work at that park and to stress things like using the word enslaved over slave. I had a black woman come to me the other day, first time it's ever happened, and say thank you for using the word enslaved over slave, but I want to share that with my colleagues, so where can I get a copy of that?
I can send it to you.
Okay, good. Thank you.
I'm Ricky Davenport from Drayton Hall, and I've spoke to a few people yesterday telling them a situation that we have with using the term enslaved, and we've gone to making sure that all of our interpreters explain what the word means, because some people don't know what that word means, and they think we're talking about slaves who work in the house instead of outside, or don't know that we're even speaking about people who are enslaved. So we always explain what that term means. But we've had situations also where African American people, not old ones, but just African American people in general, are angry that we're using the word and say we're just trying to be PC and sugarcoat the whole thing. What would be a response that you might suggest from any of y'all?
Well, before my tour even starts, I define the words I'm going to use. And just as I stated before, I say enslaved because I'm speaking to the condition that they were forced into, not who they were. They were human beings with family, feelings, culture, intellect. After I explain it that way, I don't hear, no one objects to it. And usually they're like, wow, I never thought about that. I'm never going to use that term again. That's usually the reaction I get. Now, you might have, actually, Dr. Swan Wright's conference she had a few years ago, and it was a woman, an older white woman who was a docent, and she just could not wrap her mind around. She said, why can't, that's what we've been saying all these years, why can't we say slave? But once again, that type of person won't be around long, so. I mean, so it's some people, where I'm saying that tongue in cheek, but some people just won't get it. You can't get, everybody's not going to get it. Yeah. And for those people who don't, just move on.
And generationally,
yeah.
My mother used the term colored. Mm-hmm. My parents would be in their 90s. And so with different generations of visitors, in addition to slave and enslaved, you're going to have people who are comfortable with black and who are not comfortable with African American. The people who are used to Afro-American, and that's the lexicon, that's the term they use. We have, my wife and I have some older girlfriends. We have a girlfriend who's 103. And she's in the colored to Negro generation in what she uses. Our 94-year-old girlfriend says, don't ever call me black. So there's sensitivity within generations of African Americans of how they use their terms. My grandmother passed at 102, and she'd lost her eyesight to the glaucoma, but she would answer the door at our house in Chicago, and the first thing she wanted to know, are you white or colored? She would ask each person, then she would know how she's going to respond socially to the situation. So there are lots of nuances in language that we have to be sensitive to.
I have a question that occurred to me as I was listening to your presentations, and the presentations were fascinating, each one. And John, you talked a lot about the importance of communicating an understanding of the African diaspora and the slave trade. And it got me thinking about how Christy and Angela talked about the particularness of the individual story and experience. And I would like to ask each of you to talk about the means in which these ideas are discussed and imparted. What works? What creates a connection with an audience? What? And we've talked about first, about the experience of a tour, but tell us about like the craft of creating an exhibition at the National Museum of African American History and Culture.
One of the questions that came up to us from public engagement sessions that we had as we were formulating how we were going to tell, what stories we were going to tell and how we were going to tell them. People said, well, how are you going to incorporate the African diaspora in a museum that is U.S.-centric and that looks at the American experience through an African-American lens? Well, part of it is looking at those different colonial owners, so that you have to bring in the Louisiana story before it becomes part of the United States. And let me give an example in Baltimore. The Order of the Oblate Sisters was an order of black nuns in Haiti. And with the Haitian Revolution, they flee to Louisiana and then are installed in the Catholic city of Baltimore. And so they are teaching black children in Baltimore for the last 180 years. So that's an example of the African diaspora being part of Baltimore for 180 years. These women never learned English. They spoke in French and Creole. I mean, the initial group of women. I was at a session at the Association of Applied Anthropology last year, which was looking at Park Service sites that were designated not around African American history, but since then it's been discovered there is an African American layer. And there's a battle site from the Civil War outside of Baltimore. And it's known for that logistic moment in the war. But the battle took place on a plantation of French owners who had left Haiti, again, resettled outside of Baltimore, and this family was continually criticized for giving insufficient food and clothing to its enslaved population. So there are ways of showing how the Barbados, Jamaica, Haiti stories are interwoven into our 18th century history, into our 19th century history, and into our 20th century history.
Christy, do you have...
I'm trying to give specific ideas about this. To me, it's incomplete if you don't have a sense of the diaspora. A couple of examples are popping into my head. I remember getting into a very heated debate with some of our curators, and in fact, one of our architectural historians, an archaeologist, Marley Brown, I'll never forget it, about one of the properties that we were interpreting, and I had gone back and read one of the original reports that was done in the 1920s or 1930s on this particular property, and there was this curious thing in there about bottles and glass and the location of these things and the presence of this being buried in the door way. And it was dismissed in the report as just a trash heap. And so you all are going, right? Well, I had the same reaction. I was like, oh, they don't even know what they're talking about. Because part of the challenge is, there is this, or there has been this presumption that, by the time you're second or third or fourth generation American born, that somehow there is no cultural memory or passage of practice. And so, so this can't possibly mean something. Well, of course it doesn't mean anything if you haven't spent any time to understand the cultural elements of this diaspora, of these people that are coming from the Congo region and the different groups and what they're doing and their religious practice. If you don't even have a basic understanding of some of these people's cosmology, then how in the world can you then extrapolate and understand what's happening on the ground or in the ground during the report? And so that's just an example of a fight. And then I ended up, ignoring them and making it a part of the interpretation anyway. I used to do things like that and, try to be better about it now. Likewise, one of the, with the Civil War, one of the things that our exhibit does, and unfortunately not as prominently as I like, but one of the things that it talks about are these self-emancipators. You say freedom seekers, we say self-emancipators at our place. With self-emancipators is that, the Underground Railroad, everybody, has it going north. Well, we also talk about the one heading south into Mexico and what impact that would have and why it's so important. And so there is an element to that that we explore and what kind of impact it has not only on what will become Mexican society, or expanded out in terms of Afro-Mestizo societies. So it's important. What it is, the very thing that we are tied to and that we're trying to do is, again, it's bringing, by understanding the various elements and the complexities as much as you're able of the diaspora, it again brings texture to the lives of the people that we're exploring. It's just that simple. And that texture is vastly important. I am not what I do. And too often we have taken that approach in our interpretations, that you are what you do. And that's not completely who we are. It's a part of who we are. So that's how I would respond to that. It's a pretty complex question that you were asking.
If I could just add one example. Sometimes it was a national institution, you have a much broader range than a state or a local place, and you can seek stories that help you fill in this diaspora component. We were able to acquire a silver teapot done by a black silversmith from St. Croix, Benson. It's on display in the Smithsonian Castle now. But he's the first African-American silversmith to have his own mark. And he moves between St. Croix and Philadelphia. And so we're able to talk about that mobility through this object. Again, another diaspora example.
There's a question from Dr. Diane Swan-Wright.
Well, it's really a comment.
Okay.
I'm sitting here and I'm thinking back to the early 1990s. Every year, and Christy, you will remember this, we would get together, and when I say we, I mean people who interpreted slavery at plantation sites or Colonial Williamsburg, and we would talk about the issues and the problems we had and talking about slavery to the rest of the world. And we were very brave, and we came up with vocabulary words, very much like yours, Angela, and we talked about those things for 2 days, and then we would go away and we would go back into the trenches. And so I am, in some ways, a little bit disappointed that we haven't moved beyond that. I think that our goal then, I know mine was, especially when I worked here at Monticello, was to really take away what slavery had done, which was to take away the humanity of individuals. And I think the only way that you can restore that humanity is by telling the truth. And we used to talk a lot about the truth back then, and we used to talk a lot about trust. I remember making a statement on a panel, and Cinder came back to me and said, "Did you really say that?" And I said, "I don't remember, but I must have." But it was something about trusting people on my team to tell the truth about what we knew. And these are all very, very human issues. And I think that where I hope we go right now in interpreting slavery is being able to use what we talked about yesterday. Can we restore the humanity of people by giving the facts? Because we have a lot of facts right now. And we have a lot of information that we can convey to the public. And I think that if we can learn to convey that information the way that you're doing here today, John, so eloquently with maps to make a point, and the way, Christy, that you're talking about doing by not just taking one perspective, but by taking a whole bunch of perspectives and looking at the Civil War and its impact on people, not just from what they know, but from what is. I think that if we could just use those perspectives and those facts, that hopefully in 20 years, and I don't believe it was 20 years ago that we used to have those talks, that we'll get someplace. And we won't have, Angela, you feeling like you're on the battlefield by yourself, and you have to, at the beginning of each tour, sort of let people know that they're on the battleground here. I'm hoping that the battleground will simply be telling the truth, talking about the facts, and then letting people recognize that they learned something new that day, and that it really was a very good thing.
I really need to piggyback a little bit on what Diane was saying, because I was invited to participate in a similar seminar not even 6 months ago in Philadelphia. And my comment was the same. I feel like I had the same conversation 20 years ago. But since that, I'm going to be a little kinder. Because since that event, I've had more time to process what is happening. 20 years ago, we were absolutely taking risks. We were absolutely learning new things, because the scholarship wasn't in its infancy, it was still a teenager. So it was messy, and we were trying to navigate the scholarship as much as we could with these new technologies and methodologies that we were trying to employ. Today, as a result of what was happening 20 years ago, more institutions got brave. It was no longer just the big boys who could afford to take the risk. Because that's what it was. I mean, really, it was the big boys. It was Williamsburg, it was Monticello, it was Mount Vernon, it was, to some degree, Montpelier at the time. That kind of went that way. But the point is, the bigger institutions could do it. They could, again, take the risk. They could, and if it wasn't working the way they wanted, they could still offer it, but put it over there in that little corner for the people who go want to seek it. Truth be told, because that's what a lot of them did. Here's this thing over here. It's a special other half thing, and you can do it. What's happened in the subsequent 20 years is that smaller institutions have joined in. Smaller institutions have the societal and cultural sense of responsibility to do it. Now, that's vastly different. There wasn't a sense of responsibility, per se, on the average docent's mind. The average docent 20 years ago wanted to do what the visitor expected and wanted to do it comfortably, and we want to treat our guests really well, and we don't want them to be uncomfortable about anything. Well, Angela's in this generation now where she doesn't care. I mean, she already said it. I don't care about how comfortable you are. My job is to tell you the way it is. Now, we're going to work on her just a little bit, soften that up, because you should care. History is about our common relationships to each other. But I will argue also that what is happening in this so-called post-racial is that it isn't. The problem is now, what you're coming up against, is now we're coming up against a backlash of boomers who felt like we revolutionized America, and so this whole deal shouldn't even be a part of this. I mean, we're the civil rights generation, and all men are created equal and all that kind of stuff, and I have a dream and content of my character and blah, 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 blah. And they've got kids and grandkids who really are global in their thinking, who their connection is to a broader world. They're not directly connected, or don't at this stage see themselves as being specifically, this is just who I am from Charleston, South Carolina. So in this so-called post-racial world, what's happened is we don't want to talk about it for different reasons. Not because we're ashamed or embarrassed. It's that we have forgotten, haven't been told why it's relevant. And we are not conveying the relevancy of this story to our guests. It isn't just about what happened 150 years ago, or 200, or 300, or 500 years ago. It is about the issue of relevance, because people can get their information just by Googling. They don't have to sit and listen to you for 30 minutes. So you better give them that missing piece. And that's where I think, that's where my hope of today's conversation, this weekend's conversation, as you were pondering these things, and that's why I said strategically important in the beginning, and I say it over and over and over again. What is your strategic purpose? And it better also have this sense of relevance to your audience. And that's all I have to say.
Oh, no. We're not, so strategic relevance. Just to get back to the panel, a central question before answering these is, how do you, panelists, react to yesterday's program, which was about the increasing access of digital availability of all kinds of databases that expand the knowledge, the facts of slavery? How perhaps have your perspectives changed? I have a hunch of how John might answer this, but how have things changed? Are we telling a more contextualized story now than we did 20 years ago?
I think we are. Since we're still in a planning phase, I've been looking not just at the United States and how slavery is interpreted. I've spent time in French institutions, in Brazilian institutions. And I go to the Museums Association of the Caribbean and look at how our colleagues in other places are also dealing with this. The French are very reluctant to discuss. They can discuss immigration, but they won't discuss colonialism and what preceded it. So they're different kind of challenges. Let me give you one example that I thought was different from any approach I've seen anywhere. There's a museum in Sao Paulo called the Museum of the Portuguese Language. And it takes the evolution of Portuguese from a Latin language to before Portuguese crosses the ocean. And it looks at what was happening in Africa for the last 4,000 years, what was happening in the Americas for the last 4,000 years, and what was happening in Europe. And then at 1500, there's that encounter. And they look then at how Ewe, Fon, Yoruba people arrive in different waves in Brazil and have the impact on the Brazilian language. And how the Japanese and Chinese and Arab-speaking Brazilians come and have an impact on that language. So they have these three timelines and how they interact. And I'd never seen that done as a way of explaining how these different strains of people come together in one place and then make history together.
This kind of goes with what you were just saying about. So, to my knowledge, there haven't been, and correct me if I'm wrong, there haven't been other slave auction programs at CW since '94, or really at very many other historic sites. Do you think that? Why do you think that is, and do you think that the climate is changing now that we might start seeing programs like that in 2013 and in the future?
Well, they haven't been happening necessarily in museums, and honestly, when we did it the first time, it wasn't a matter of whether or not we were going to do it again. It was just, we want to do it. Programs kind of changed up. The theme for the weekend would stay the same, but the programs themselves changed up. I will tell you from a personal perspective, it was traumatic. You know, I actually suffered sort of a post-traumatic stress after that. And that's a very personal statement, but it is very real. I mean, when you have people calling your house, when you have all kinds of things being said to you, when you find out that there are people with guns who are there in the crowds, there to protect you, but nonetheless, that at any moment it could have turned into something else. It was, for the first time in my life, a real look at, I don't really have control of anything in my environment. And that was a scary thought, and it kind of messed with my head for a while. And then I got over it and moved on. But what's interesting is, for some people, it became, I started seeing newspaper articles about school teachers doing slave auctions in their classrooms. Or programs, you know, that while the intent may have been very good to help people understand the daily life, the so forth work of the enslaved, you know, dare I say, be a slave for a day kinds of things. The problem is that they often weren't explained well, so of course it becomes a big mess when there really shouldn't have been a mess around those. The teacher's intent, more often than not, the teachers, especially elementary school teachers doing that, it's not their area of specialization. So and I had friends that would send me this stuff, and I'd scratch my head going, what are people doing? Leave it to the professionals, for God's sake. But the reality is, when it was all said and done, the response was overwhelmingly positive and overwhelmingly supportive, both from the academic and the public history community. The challenge is that the audience, there was an example where audience was ready, public wasn't ready. The public just could only absorb so much, and especially something so big. So at least at Williamsburg, what we did is we pulled it back so that the really harsh things became that special activity. We actually started giving, for lack of a better term, PG-13s, so that the programming that we had that dealt with miscegenation and interracial sex and that dynamic, visitors knew in advance that it would have content like that. So general programming would touch on these elements but wouldn't get into the harsh emotionalism that it created. You had to self-select to participate in that experience. That's the way it ended up being at Williamsburg, and I don't know honestly what happened after I left in '99 and went to Detroit. which was going into a community that had a completely different expectation of its interpretation of slavery and wanted me to fix it. Because for them, what they had was sterile, even for an African American institution. They were very angry with their, the community was very angry with the way slavery was depicted in its own museum and wanted it changed. So here was an opportunity to explore that and again try to work that balance of the scholarship, that history, that heritage, and that memory piece in such a way that that community could embrace its museum and could embrace that exhibit again. And you know, it's just about the ebb and flow. I mean, truth be told, do you want to do it at your site? No. You're going, no, I don't want to deal with that. Because it does take on, you can talk about it to actually depict it. It's weird. People will watch a film all day about it. You can present a film, but when it's in the real, it is the most unsettling thing for an audience. And like I said, so now institutions that do it or offer it or what have you, they do it in a self-select method for the visitor. You know, and again, you can touch on these issues, you can talk about these issues, but actually depiction of issues is something that, honestly, I still think audiences need to self-select. They know where they're at and what they can do with those things. I was asked at the time, actually, somebody, one of the detractors said, well, you wouldn't reenact a whipping or you wouldn't reenact a rape. Why would you reenact an auction? And I said, well, the truth of the matter is we have reenacted whipping. It was off stage, but it was heard. And it was extraordinary for the guests that were involved. Rape, no. You're right. The effects, the after effects, yes. So, and have done it in a historical setting.
If I could just briefly add, the Association of African American Museums does a Black History Tour as part of our conference so that we learn the local history of each city. And when we were in St. Louis, the tour, and the organization is a mixed group. The tour went to the steps of the courthouse.
Right.
Were you there?
No, that was another email.
We go to the courthouse steps, and everybody in the group had to line up on the steps. And they said, this is an estate sale, you're all for sale right now. And African American and European American were both very uncomfortable. I said, okay, everybody turn right, turn to your left. You might be disrobed at this moment. It was very shocking for the whole group. So there are different situations wherein it can be used. Gentleman there has had a question for a long time.
Frank, right.
My questions are kind of along the same theme. This is a conference about interpreting slavery at a historic site. And the truth of historic sites is that so many of them are underfunded, they have no professional staffs, their education programs are not great. Many of those are plantations. I'm wondering, you're talking about an interpretive experience at a highly specialized site. There's nothing much like Williamsburg. And Monticello is also a place where there's a great deal of resources and scholarship and evidence about slavery. So everybody's kind of struggling with this. I mean, everyone, I think, is very earnest about their desire to do the right thing. But the three of you, do you think that a lot of sites should even try this, or should they stay away from it for fear of doing a really bad job and sending people away with the wrong message?
I think that's a valid point. Resources is probably the most challenging piece for the smaller historic site, whether it's a plantation house or, quite frankly, historic Tredegar, where I am now, is a much smaller institution than I have been accustomed to working with. And so, but it is also an issue of importance to the mission of the place. I'm also, quite frankly, a believer that sometimes places run, their institutional life has run its course, honestly. And I know that sounds a little harsh, but there are some places that probably should just be done with it. Move on, close down, you're done. Rather than thinking this is going to be the new panacea that's going to get your institution up and off the ground, and now all of a sudden you're talking about slavery and tons of black people are going to come, because they're not. You know, for the most part, if you're lucky, you'll, depending on your site, you know, you may get up to 6% of your audience as being black people. And but generally, but that shouldn't be the motivation. To me, that shouldn't be the motivation for doing this. If the resources are limited, you have to make a determination of where am I going to put those resources. And it's a decision that executive directors have to make every day. Where do you put the resources? What is strategically important? And sometimes that will shift during the life of an organization. I will tell you, the Historic Tredegar, we have a budget of about $1.5 million. I mean, that's like what I used to sneeze at. And, you know, so I've had to learn to do that. You know, what's important for our site, what's important to my staff, what do they need? And I have, as an executive director, I have shifted things. Not so much, well, the interpretation, the good news is Tredegar from its beginning was about, you know, this ironworks place and about this idea of the 3 stories in the Civil War. Resources-wise, we don't have the material culture that we'd love to have. We can't afford it. But there were certain things that we decided to do to invest staff personnel to bring funds in a different way. And so, and it's working, I should say. But in the coming, over the next 24 to 36 months, for the first time, we're going to have new galleries and new spaces to talk about these issues even further. But it's tough. You have to make a choice. You have to decide, you know, are we going to put on the summer, what do you call it? The farm days on the plantation farm days program, where everybody comes out and they learn how you churn butter and you make stuff and you weave and you know, and you have a couple living history interpreters there on the side are going to do stuff for you. You have to decide whether or not you take your risk in the special event and see how it happens. That this time we're going to, rather than having our people cook the Brunswick stew, and I'm just throwing stuff out, maybe they make Hoppin' John this time. You're going to convert it to where you're going to talk about African American foodways, or maybe you're going to talk about, you know, you can do it. You can do it within the frame. It's just, it is a conscious, it is a financial decision. And the good news is, though, for the small site, all you have to do is ask. You really aren't an island. See, this has been going on for 35 years, almost 40 years for a lot of sites. You are not out here as the only one doing it, so stop patting yourself on the back. It's been going on for 40 years. It's great that you're doing what you're doing, and we want to do better. And there is a network of people who are out there doing this every day. Pick up the phone. They will tell you what has worked for them, what hasn't, how you can move forward in this direction or that direction. They're out there. They really are. And as the old folks used to say, there really isn't a whole lot new under the sun. We might be using a mobile app to show it now. But that's the other thing. Consider technologies to help you as well.
If I could piggyback on Christy's comment, One of our challenges, of course, is to interpret slavery in the North, to interpret slavery in urban settings. Part of the Smithsonian has a number of grand challenges, but the grand challenge I most work under is telling all of America's story. So you're not focusing this to get an African American audience.
Right.
You're doing this to inform all of your public of the role that African Americans had in your site. I went to elementary school in New York. They never mentioned slavery in New York. It wasn't until the African burial ground was discovered in 1991 in Wall Street, in Lower Manhattan. They discovered this cemetery with 20,000 Africans, many of them born on the continent, and they're the people who built the wall for which Wall Street is named. The cemetery is closed in the mid-18th century. So New Yorkers and Bostonians, and particularly people in Rhode Island, need to learn the history of the whole state. I just went to Black New England Conference, and it's an annual conference looking at the history of blacks in New England. And this is, it's assumed everybody's in the South, but 1605, whatever early dates, you have African American populations in all the states. Florida, and one last dig. We were obsessed with this 1619. I know we're getting ready to celebrate it. But Florida is looking at 500 years. Yep. This is 1513. So because we don't look at Florida until the 1830s, we've missed 300 years of black presence in Florida. And so we need to move beyond what we're comfortable with and go past 1619. Yep. Excuse me.
Thank you. We have another question, and I'm sorry to say that we have only 12 minutes left. This has gone very quickly, so we're going to try and answer as many questions as we can. Harold.
It's just a comment, but I know in terms of warning guests, working at Colonial Williamsburg, and both of us, my colleague and I, have a unique position because we not only interpret urban slavery, but plantation slavery being at Colonial Williamsburg. We have to warn people that the tour is about slavery, because people come and they want to see the house, and when they come to the tour and they find out it's about slavery, they complain. And they send all those complaints up to the administration, and then it comes back to us. So then we have to, again, go back into, because we stopped, and then we had to go back into, listen, all the interpreters that are sitting on the gate, you need to tell the guests that it's about slavery. So if you don't want to hear about slavery, then you need to turn around and go somewhere else. And also, too, about the exchange of the scholarship. On our tours, particularly at Great Hopes, interpreting slavery, we actually let the guests see the scholarship, see the documents for themselves. And it also gives us credibility also, because then they know we're not making it up, because they're actually seeing the information before their eyes and they're able to see it. And it is most certainly challenging. Most certainly is.
Do you have a comment? Anyone have a comment?
Well, being a Williamsburg alum, let me just say that a lot of what I've seen recently is very, very good. I understand some of the challenges that are faced there. And what you're explaining, unfortunately, is a 20-year-old problem, because the visitors are never going to read that Visitor's Companion. They just don't read it. They don't pay any attention to it. And if they're still doing what they had started doing about 10 years ago, and that's rotating you guys from the gate to the interpretation, it is problematic to help them understand. So I'll have to talk to you offline. Because, at the core, I think of the problem is the organizational structure now is a mess, in my view. I probably shouldn't have said that publicly, huh? But it is a problem. They, in the desire to kind of integrate everything, vision and focus has been lost, in my view. And it has been something that is a decision that a lot of institutions have made because of tough financial times. There is this desire to kind of, we can't afford specialization anymore. And so what happens is the visitor experience shifts because of that. And don't make those mistakes if you can.
I would like to say at Hampton National Historic Site, our theme is to tell the whole story. So it's not about a specialized tour. When you come to Hampton, you are going to hear the whole story. And that's what needs to be implemented. And getting back to the as far as the gentleman's question about should we tell this story? I strongly believe that you should. And there are, like you said, there is help out there. You just need to go to the right people who will actually help you formulate a plan. This story needs to be told. That's all.
Thank you.
Quick question of fact, maybe mainly for John. My wife and I were in Manhattan a year ago, and we went to the New York Historical Society. And when we were there were the remnants of an exhibit, apparently a large one they had done on slavery in New York, which we gathered vaguely had been quite controversial. My question of fact is, how are museums and sites in the North doing on this score now? Are there just a few?
I think they're getting better. I mean, I think that exhibit, Slavery in New York, it was a hot topic. I don't think it was controversial. I think it was just stunning for New Yorkers. They had no idea, because it's a part of, it's a part of this idea is, slavery's only in the South. Civil War, we won, we're done. So there was no sense of connectedness to that story. So I think it was a situation of shock. But there are a number of sites in New England, in the Northeast, that have been interpreting slavery, whether it's in an urban setting or a small mill setting or whatever that have been going on. I'm aware of a couple that have been going on for at least 10 or 15 years, and they are very good.
And you're talking about they're dealing with slavery
yes.
in that area.
In that area. Mm-hmm. Yes. Strawberry Banks, yes, fabulous. Phillipsburg Manor. There are a few that have done a really good job at it.
The Black New England Conference was in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. And Portsmouth, New Hampshire has a Black History Trail explaining where the slaves were held, who owned slaves in the city, where the harbor was. And so a number of places are actually fully exploring that. I mentioned Rhode Island. I spoke at Rhode Island College, and they were looking at the links between Rhode Island and at the time of the Civil War. And I had to remind people that Rhode Island had 23 rum distilleries. Does sugar grow there? And the Rhode Island distillers were importing sugar not only from the South of the United States, but from Cuba, where slavery doesn't end until 1886. So here's Rhode Island deeply enmeshed, not only in the supply of its cotton for its textile industry, but from the sugar that then that's transformed into rum and exported to Europe. But they had to be shown these links and how they're part of a larger economy, and that links them to slavery.
First of all, again, I'd like to thank all of you very much. This has been extraordinary. I work at a small site in South Carolina that was the home of the governor who pushed for secession. So I do have some very wonderful visitors, but you can also imagine the other half of visitors that I have who told me that slavery would be just like if somebody told me I couldn't have a truck anymore. And how would I feel about that? I am not in charge at my site, so I am 100% on board with all of this. I mean, this is my life. I kind of straddle the generations of growing up with parents who used colored and Negro, and me being, 100% the other way, going, yeah, we got to tell them. We got to tell it the most shocking way we can, because that's the only way you're going to remember it, and you have to experience it for yourself, and let me put shackles on you, and let me make you go get the water from the well. But I'm not in charge. And I think following up on what he said earlier, resources are not the problem at my site. It's the administration who sent us to this conference, who paid for us to come. And we're going to go back with all these ideas, and they're going to go, yeah, okay, we need to do slavery. Well, no, don't do that. Just do a little bit. And I feel like, no, I don't want to do a little bit. I want to do everything. So do you have any suggestions about that for those of us?
Yes, and in 3 minutes.
3 minutes.
He's over here, Christy. You got this. Because I think Angela should say something on this one too. Again, I think I said before, talking about the slave auction. Fortunately enough, at the time when I was first starting out my career at Williamsburg, most people didn't pay a whole lot of attention to what I did, so I was able to get away with a lot programmatically. But when they did start paying a lot of attention to what was happening, and especially when I took over the director's seat, I didn't have that problem. I had an administration that challenged us to be bold, that challenged us to be provocative if we needed to be, that could absorb the hit. When you're small, absorbing the hit is a problem. When you're in Charleston, South Carolina, and you're dealing with secession, and you're dealing with all of those kinds of things.
People. Personally, I will, but I need my...
Well, let me tell you what great advice came from scholar Jim Horton, Jim Horton, goes out and during the sesquicentennial has been going out talking to a lot of groups and has actually been invited by a couple Southern Heritage groups to talk because he's built a whole presentation on these issues from little-known Confederate sources. So, for example, the first thing he does is he says, so this whole conversation about the war between the states, let me be clear. Robert E. Lee said on X date that we are engaged in a civil war. I don't want to hear war between the states or the war of northern aggression again. And then he goes on and cites. I mean, it's brilliant, brilliant. And so that might be a technique for your executive director who's afraid of what half of your constituency is going to say. My colleagues at the Museum of the Confederacy, for the last 15 years, if not more, have literally been fighting for its life and its relevancy. There are people to this day that come to the Museum and White House of the Confederacy, and before they step in, literally get on the ground and kiss it, according to my colleague who's the executive director there. So these people, and the fact that there are neo-Confederates now, there's a huge British contingent of them too, by the way.
And their tours to Liverpool.
And their tours, yes, it's stunning what's happening because the narrative was so carefully crafted. The North was so happy to say we won, we're done, that we really did, the South rose again and created a whole different perspective of it. And that is what sells, and that what became in popular culture. And so your site is dealing with that. There are legitimate issues around rule of law and secession that have to be discussed, but at its core, the issues of slavery and the role of slavery and the role of the American South and the fact that 90% of the world's cotton is produced in the American South and that the wealth is expanding at an exponential rate. And no, it is not a system that is getting ready to go away or going to die out on its own because the South wanted to expand. That was what this was about. They wanted to expand, and there were actually plans of the government to try to invade Mexico to get the lands that they wanted. It was a part of the Grand Manifesto. So my point is, your executive director, you're going to have to go in from the place of comfort to mash all that up, and then begin to lay out the programmatic agenda. It would be my advice.
Thank you all for a superb session. A few logistical notes. It's lunchtime. There will be box lunches available outside of this room. You are welcome to enjoy them anywhere throughout this house. Top floor, there are several rooms with tables and chairs, and you're welcome to return back here. We will be showing an animation in here that didn't quite work yesterday at the Woodland Pavilion. The Picturing Monticello animation will be on a continuous loop. We'll be here to talk about it and anything and enjoy the conversation, but please be back in your seats at 1 p.m.